Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game. So, today we're continuing a series on the MiSTer FPGA DE10 Nano project. More specifically, in this instance, the work-in-progress Atari Jaguar core. This is going to be a bit of an interesting video because what I have in front of you is an Atari CoJag arcade board. This is Area 51. This is running on the Atari Jaguar hardware with some enhancements to the memory and CPU. And I picked this up to kind of reverse engineer some of it to feed information off the developers to see maybe if we could get some Atari Jaguar arcade games running in the core. Before we get too far involved though, do me a huge favor down below, hit like and subscribe and ring that notification bell, definitely helps us out. If you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, we got a Patreon link down below as well. And secondarily, I am using a new camera for the channel for this video. You're going to see it intercut in videos moving forward in the future until I get rid of all the videos that ran on this. So leave me a comment down below and tell me what you think of the overall quality here. Now taking a look at the top board, this is the ROM board, but not the game in and of itself. This is where basically the boot ROM is going to live, as well as a Motorola 68020. Now the Atari Jaguar uses a Motorola 68000. This has a higher clocked and a little bit more instruction set CPU on board. You'll see it right here, that's the 68020, so it just has more instructions than the 68000, but the question is how many of those instructions are being used by the CoJag board, and can those be incorporated over to the MiSTer FPGA side of things? Because when you play an Atari Jaguar, 3 chips are basically doing everything. Tom and Jerry, the CPU and the DSP, as well as the Motorola 68000. And if that chip sounds familiar, it isn't basically every other console and arcade board back in the 90s. Sega Genesis, Neo Geo, everything basically ran on a variant of the Motorola processor for the longest time. So it's not surprising it was in the Atari Jaguar. Now most games didn't use it for anything more than low-level I/O and things like that, but some games basically bypassed the entire DSP and CPU of the Jaguar and would lean on that 68000 because people knew how to program for it, because the actual SDK and toolset Atari provided was very poor. Now these 4 ROMs here basically will get the game going and hand it off to the actual silicon to run. And you'll see this board is working, but it came in with all of the EEPROM windows completely unstickered, and if you're not aware, UV light will erase these, so I went ahead and just used a label maker so I could both cover those up and remember what these ROMs are. Although it's my only CoJag board, it'd be pretty hard pressed to forget that this was Area 51. If you ever have arcade boards or any other boards with the EEPROM window open like that, you do need to cover them before they erase themselves. Now obviously being an arcade board and not a home console, it runs off a JAMA edge, but honestly Atari left the Jaguar with that raw card edge on the side as well when you would actually get RGB out of it, so really not that unfamiliar. You'll see here there's also a little switch. This is going to be the ROM test. If you boot the board with that in the on position, you're going to get the entire testing diagnostic screen up on your screen versus actually playing the game. And over on the side, you have different inputs, including JGun 2 and JGun 1, assuming that means Jaguar Gun, and those are both marked as HAP. The pins are a little bent, but definitely nothing I can't fix. It's pretty easy to take care of these, and the board, like I said, was sold working, and I have tested it in the background. It's totally fine. I just need to wire up my HAP guns for that connector. And additionally, it does run off an IDE hard drive versus the type of cartridges you would see on Atari Jaguar. So that is the secondary change on this. Other than having that 68020, the games basically boot from the ROM and then hand off to the IDE hard drive, which will then have the executable on it. Versus something like an Atari Jaguar with Tempest 2000 here, this is footage from the MiSTer FPGA core where it would just run on ROM chips off the cart. So as far as storage space is concerned, obviously that hard drive has way more than Atari Jaguar cart and probably pretty close to similar to something like the Atari Jaguar CD. But underneath, we want to take a look here to get to the RAM component of the board as well, because there are changes there, and I can definitely tell this board has not been taken apart for a very long time. This was one of the hardest connectors to get apart. I tried to do it on screen, but I actually had to go off screen and massage it for maybe like 5 or 6 minutes so I was actually able to get any movement. And anytime you're disassembling an arcade PCB or anything else that is old, you want to be particularly careful of the plastics on those connectors because they love to absolutely crack and break. They were a little bit brittle when they were made, and the overall years that have gone through, this board have definitely made them a lot more delicate. So usually I just kind of pry up and things pop off on camera, but this one definitely gave me hell and a half. And of course I was able to take care of that off camera so we can get underneath it. Now taking a look, this is basically the entirety of the CoJag board with that ROM board removed. It is actually a relatively simple board because it is based on a console design. There's a ton of unpopulated areas on the PCB, and obviously Tom and Jerry being dead center in the middle functioning for all of the different games you're going to be playing on this board. But do be aware there's more than one variant of the CoJag. This one has the Motorola 68020, which is important to this overall, trying to see if it would boot on the MiSTer FPGA core, but other later boards actually have an R3000 processor from MIPS, and if that sounds familiar, MIPS architecture was used in a bunch of different gaming uses, as well as with Evans and Sunderland on some of their actual VR rigs for motion simulators that actually ended up into some Namco arcade boards. Additionally, it was used on the PlayStation 2 as an I/O controller chip, so some really fun history there. But obviously we have the Jaguar CPU and the Jaguar DSP, Tom and Jerry, and that's what most games on the Jaguar will usually run off of, but it was one of those things. That's why you saw some games on the Jaguar that didn't look any more impressive than their 16-bit counterparts. That's because some developers would just lean on that 68,000 to get what they needed out of the console and to stand a game up quickly. But for the most part, for the arcade games, you're going to be using Tom and Jerry, and there isn't really a ton of games for this. Area 51 and Maximum Force are definitely the most well known. You have other games like Vicious Circle, prototypes that never actually made it to the arcade floor, so there's not a huge reason honestly to collect stuff like the CoJag. If you want to play Area 51, there's a perfectly fine PlayStation 1 port, not the type of hardware I would purchase just for a collection, but for taking a look at it and seeing whether or not it could run in the MiSTer FPGA core, I'm happy to help any way I can. Pick up the board, kind of reverse engineer it and see what's going on. Additionally, and this isn't a huge issue for the core, the Atari CoJag board does have more RAM than you would see on an actual console. It's going to be a double complement from the Atari Jaguar in and of itself. But again, RAM isn't really a big issue, it's just more memory address spacing. But when that boot ROM does load up, it'll write things to areas in RAM that the CPU will then take and run. So that's something that definitely needs to be looked at, and Electron Ash has been taking a peek at that in the background. But something like Rayman is going to use half the available RAM as the CoJag board does. And my next kind of, I wonder if it'll work, and I'll probably play around with it in the background, is if I can get Atari Jaguar games to actually boot on the CoJag board, because I do have some ROM space there. It does execute from a different memory address, but it would be fun to see. Now this board definitely has a very storied lineage as far as what's happened to it. It has seen some damage on the bottom. This is not a bodge from the factory that was correcting some sort of trace error. This is definitely something that got gouged back in the day and has gone in for repair, but the board functions, so I'm definitely going to leave this as is. Not the cleanest repair I've ever seen, but as long as it boots up, I am happy with it. And I do love when I get a little bit of the lineage of a board. On February 3rd, 2010, this went into East Coast Amusements for a certain customer, and it must have been for that repair on the underside of the board. This thing has been around a long time, and it has now reached my collection to see exactly what can be understood as far as probing it out and seeing where all of the different controls and everything else go, because that is a component of actually trying to reverse engineer anything and get it stood up in FPGA. And don't think I'm coding anything, I have absolutely no skill set for that, but I can research the board. That is my knowledge base, and these things do run off hard drives, but this is definitely going to get converted over to solid state, a compact flash card, because you can convert them there, because these hard drives absolutely love to eat themselves for breakfast. But honestly, this is not a board that's going to stay in my collection for too long. Once I actually do all of the probing and kind of get as much information off the board as I possibly can, I'll probably sell this on. I'll clean it up, convert it to solid state, and just try to get the money I put into it out of it so I can kind of break even. Because again, I can't code anything for MiSTer FPGA. I've coded a few things in the past, not on MiSTer. They were absolute messes that just seemed to work because I got lucky. But it even comes with the actual manual, and that's always fun to see it come along with the game. Although I don't know why anyone would want to convert an NBA Jam to Area 51, I'm sure that machine made more money. But going through some of the ephemera bits here can be useful as far as actually understanding how the boards work, because every once in a while they'll put a full schematic into how everything is wired up into the back of the actual manual. Unfortunately here we don't have a schematic as to how all of the different chips are wired up pathwise and pinwise to themselves. We do get at least a nice board layout that's going to list every single chip and every single component and its position on the board. It doesn't give you all the information, but it is relatively useful. And I love that it says "I'm not dead yet" down at the bottom left. I think the Atari Jaguar is trying to find different life in the arcade, because clearly it failed in the home market. But it is fun to have stuff like this, an Atari Jaguar that has a JAMA Edge and a faster processor in that Motorola 68020. And again, just from the kind of research and reverse engineering standpoint, if there's any time I can help on MiSTer FPGA with any of the arcade boards or otherwise in my collection, they're always available. But that is the Atari CoJag. It was an arcade board that failed pretty much at the arcades, minus Area 51, which was relatively a hit and did some good sales for Atari. But it really didn't keep the Atari Jaguar dream alive, but it is a fun pivot on that console hardware. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down below. And again, this is a brand new camera for the channel. It's the Blackmagic Pixis 6K, and I did shoot everything at 6K and downsample, so leave me your feedback below. Bye-bye.